Thank you very much, Greg, and thank you everybody for joining us in the third and final of this short series of exploring self-herding. We're just getting a little bit of an overlay of it and giving you a very, very brief feel for the range of things that can be done. And so today we're concentrating a little bit more on the bigger picture as far as it pertains to businesses and how we can help our business. But in order to maximise our grazing businesses, especially in the Broad, we do have to have a bigger picture, a bit of a holistic thought line to all of this, that our businesses, of course, exist within the natural realm, and that the animals that we manage across the top of them as livestock are actually replacing functions that were here prior to about 47,000 years ago. So in order for that to be beneficial for the landscape, we need to take an active role rather than just a passive role. Because if we do, there's one thing for sure, that taking a passive role means that animals will keep on repeating habits that they have learned and became graduated to, and therefore we miss an opportunity to actually implement things that give us a better business result. Importantly, I'd like you to know that adopting self-herding and changes in behavioural management isn't a choice of business versus environment or business versus people. It's actually all of those things simultaneously. You can gain advantages from that as you go along. So it doesn't become an either or. You can incorporate this in a very, very low level. It doesn't require a lot of ongoing effort most of the time. So it's a small little addition to the business activities, but with huge payoffs in both landscape and bottom lines. So some of the specifics here, and by no means an exhaustive list, because if you wanted a full list of how this implemented and affected businesses in the positive, we would be having a reading of 100 or more categories at least. But here's just some of the big ones here that you can read. And the Larson cartoon on the right is some sheep discussing whether they actually need a border collie to tell them what to do. Well, no, they don't need the border collie to tell them what to do, but as soon as the influence comes in, then everything else changes. So that list on the left there will be covering some of those things, and the ones that aren't listed there, you may read excerpts about the applicability and how you make those happen on your own property in the self-herding book, which we'll mention later on in the broadcast. So a big point that overlays whatever you're doing on your property is, if your business is livestock related in large ways or small, there's one thing for sure, that the human-animal interaction is the dominating influence in those animals' lives. And that might seem like a large claim, but I'm not talking about just when you're standing and interacting with the animals or directly. Everything we do still keeps on rattling on for those animals' lives in days, weeks, months and years later. And something that my old football coach told me was that practice doesn't make perfect, perfect practice makes perfect. And when you really understand that, then in any sphere in life, it leads you on an endless quest for improvement, a constant improvement journey, and that's what this is about. So we're going to let our animals choose what we want, and that's a big statement there. We are going to do as little as possible on the other side of the spectrum, which is force them to do what we want. Both things can be effective, but choice gives you a really, really wide range of means to getting to the end, which is your business goals, after all. And where self-herding starts to really come into effect as far as your whole business goes is that it starts to affect the other 16 hours. And what I mean by that is that grazing management approaches, systems, methods, tactics, all of the above, especially over the last 35 years where there's been a lot of interest in that, have been directed at how much consumption animals are allowed to do in any one area. And indeed, while that is the correct and proper place to start with our livestock grazing management, it doesn't largely affect the other two major things that animals do, of course, which is impact the ground areas by their presence and also redistribute nutrients via dung and urine. And that's the other 16 hours. What's happening out there, if we just leave them to their own habits that they continue to reinforce, then we'll get accumulation of both their physical impact and then also their nutrient dispersal. And so with self-herding, you can put signals and cues out in the landscape that make sure that the animals are going and heading towards the goals you're desiring all times of the night and day. So it's an influence that we can put out well beyond what we could do, even if we're out there with a shepherd's crook out there all the time. And behaviour is inherently a foundation for the grazing impacts your animals exhibit across the landscape. So that can make two businesses identical in most other ways, profitable and unprofitable with their livestock business. So the way animals are grazing and utilising the landscape is really the be-all and end-all of any grazing businesses. And if animals are carrying residual levels of stress, in other words, the low stress levels, if they're carrying low levels there, then this then influences them to tend to avoid things of novelty, difference, or difficulty. So therefore, the animals don't go and utilise the whole landscape as much as they could than if they were completely carrying in a stress-free and anxiety-free manner. And when they are encountering plants in the landscape, each plant value is actually determined by two things. We usually only look at the second thing listed there, the nutritive value. So that's usually how it's expressed to graziers, either from research end of things or even in their own thing. That's a palatable plant or not a palatable plant is usually the way that things are considered. But a lot of that then depends on the voluntary feed intake. So if something is very nutrient rich, but the animals don't choose to take much grazing of it, then that isn't just because it's less palatable. It's part of the whole experience of that the animal has had in its life and even before it's born, which we'll deal with shortly. So we are going to influence the voluntary feed intake of our animals by using self-herding tools and tactics, and they're going to work for us all the night and the day. And so we have lots and lots of examples, and here's just one from an individual animal. This is the same animal's tracks, but on this particular station example, we were trying to get the animals, and this is a large group of animals, to go more towards the coast, start grazing the coastal country. And that's the changes of one animal alone, how it tracked out and showing clearly that fanning out in the directions that the staff were indicating for the animal over that period of time. Whereas traditionally, they always came more down towards the bottom of the picture. That was the habitual nature of the herds there for a long time. In a very, very short period of time, we started to get them out to fan out in a direction that they hadn't ever chosen to do before. So if we put self-herding on top of grazing management, whether you have large areas or small, it's still applicable because it redistributes the way animals are spread across the landscape. And importantly, we're going to make that variable. So when we just look at a regular paddock, even if it's stocked, and in this very, very simplistic example we've used here, that it's just one animal per unit area, call it 1 per acre or 1 per hectare, whatever you want to do. If the animals are in there, they're never grazing that area uniformly. It's only when we get to really confined spaces, such as in dairy strip grazing examples and that sort of thing, that you get evenness of grazing when the animals are being forced. But of course, they're being forced to occupy those areas. So where animals have any choice in the matter at all, their habits will lead them to be spread out over the landscape in uneven densities. And that will always happen. So shifting that unevenness is what self-herding's about. Instead of trying to restrict and stop them from being somewhere else, we're going to get them to choose to start going to some of the places that they weren't before. So for those producers that are already involved in more intensive grazing and maybe have many subdivisions, who quite rightly would ask the question, well, why would I be doing self-herding? Well, when we're rotating around that sort of an intense paddock, if the paddocks and the water points and the shade and the topography stay the same every time, then the animals will habitually go and do the same things. They'll be following the cues and signals from prior mobs and redoing those habits. So we will, over time, still continue to concentrate nutrients and animal impact on that landscape. So when we come into the same paddock over and over and over, and so this is 3 times through the exact same paddock, just making a point there with the little brown signals there, that we're going to put them somewhat differently every time those animals come into there. You don't have to overthink this at all. You don't even have to plan this. You just have to, with your eyesight and your grazing management skills and experience, say that's where I should be moving the attractant stations or the attractant signals to, because it wasn't utilised so much last time. We are actually starting to put a randomness across the landscape, which from a business point of view ends up putting more grass down the animals' throats, because they start to explore and consume more than if we just left them to their own habits. And here is a single animal example, again in different months on a station property, showing once again that we were actually wanting the animal to come off the river line, the creek line there that's fairly visible in the landscape, and wanted them to utilise more of the paddocks out here. So in that 4.5 month period there, you can see they've started to fan out and look around the landscape. And that was only our own 4.5 months, you can see. So what you have the opportunity, especially those of you that have self-replacing flocks or herds of animals, to continue to work this, so to continue to give the animals positive experiences and indications to use areas that they haven't been using before. So it can continue to build in a pattern over time, and therefore it establishes new patterns. They're new habits. So here's a specific example to throw at you of one pastoralist, and this example was over in the Gascoyne region of Western Australia, And we applied some self-herding tools to just one particular little problem that they had, which was coming off one water at muster time. They could muster the animals quite effectively off the water point, but then once they moved a few kilometres down off that water point, they'd get to a choke point in the landscape, and then the animals would scatter out at that point. And they always had lots and lots of dramas, and would spend a long time, indeed hours, just navigating through that spot. What they did was start implementing 6 months ahead of time some attractants and some cued with self-herding signals, and that's the important point for anybody joining this seminar that hasn't heard the preceding ones. It's about the signals. It's not about rewards. We're just using the rewards as the means to an end to strongly associate signals with that. But what they did every time there was a water run, which was several times a week in this particular case, that they would just do some attractants work. And they calculated that they got the backpacker to do about 6 hours work over the 6 months, and they spent approximately $50 worth of materials. When they mustered that area, they got an extra 12 clean skin bulls out of there that they didn't even know were in the area. And when they got to the choke point on their muster, it was no issue at all. The animals just kept on going in response to the signals that they were putting out in front of them as they went. So that's the sort of payoff that we can see actually in the field. 6 hours and $50 led to 12 bulls. And at current prices, of course, that is a pretty amazing return on investment. A different example from the Murchison area of Western Australia, where this set of trap yards had been set up 6 years prior to us working with the grazier, and the owner and previous owner had installed them, and they said they very rarely saw any tracks there at all, even though there was a water point in the centre of the yards, and they put licks there and other attractants and molasses drums and things from time to time. But the previous owner and the current owner had no luck with there at all, to the point that the current owner had decided that they were going to take down the trap yard and decommission the water point because it was next to useless. 2.5 weeks after they instituted self-herding cues and signals in relation to the attractants they were offering there, then this is what we found when we went round for a drive with them. Plenty of tracks, plenty of activity, plenty of animals coming and going, and indeed even clean skin animals coming in and out of the trap yard. So it's been something that's been effective rather than for 6 years prior, a useless bit of infrastructure. Not many animals were watering on it, and they certainly weren't trapping any. So here's now broadening into something much, much deeper, and only the smallest little bit of an introduction into epigenetics, the changes that you can start to get by changing the experiences of animals on a daily basis. So we're using a human body here, saying that an influence today actually affects 3 generations if the baby inside mother is actually a female, because the females are born, in the mammal case, with as many eggs as they're ever going to have in their whole life. So right today, you can actually start to affect the epigenetic signals that sit on top of the genome of your animals. So for those of you that haven't heard the term epigenetics before, just visualize it as the switches on top of the genes that activate turning your genes on and off. It's a process that works on people and and animals and every organism that's been studied till now, but not much utilised in our livestock industry because we haven't taken the fullest advantage of starting to manipulate in a business-like fashion ways, things in the environment that start to beneficially take us where we want to go. So when you actually change the anxiety levels, the experience of what is being tasted by the animal on a daily basis, you're starting to change those animals today. So it's I'm opening a door here for you to a new world that isn't just feeding or breeding. Now we're talking about reading. So it's the third leg to the pot of livestock improvement. And how important is mother in our life? Amazingly important. And with that old advertisement that I clipped out of a paper from ages ago, I'm not suggesting you should be giving cola to your babies, but it certainly would have an influence, wouldn't it? And so it is for animals. Young animals, of course, are much more experimental. They try lots and lots of things, but where is the experience? It's in the maternal line. That's where the wisdom is held for the survival of the species. But they're important guides, and they continue to encourage their young animals to do more. And that is where self-herding comes in, because it's not static. We can change and help to make those mothers show their offspring more and more different experiences. And we'll go in here in a moment to show you one of the really cheap ways that we mentioned last time about how we can start to not only do some mineral supplementation, but also some plant detoxification. And the key to starting to experiment with this on your own place is to use Bruce's Brew. And you may look up the background to that on page 44 of the free book, which we'll mention at the end of the seminar. So let's have a quick look at the ramifications of using Bruce's Brew that we mentioned last time. So as a tool, it starts to interact and affect all of the 7 principles of self-herding. It starts to rattle on effects. And this is typical of what we do with self-herding. It's not done for just one thing. It's done for usually a number of reasons, and therefore you get a number of benefits. So when we look at this simple tool, simply made at home, Bruce's Brew, half and half ash and charcoal mix, you provide it in drums that are moving. So here's the important thing, which often gets missed when I present this at seminars. People will say, oh yes, we put some ash out or we put some charcoal out. No, you'll be missing the point. Put it out as Bruce's Brew, put it out in containers that you actively take around the landscape and start introducing the animals to the opportunity of mixing Bruce's Brew with whatever plants they are consuming in front of them. And so what we're trying to do here is give the animals an additional tool to increase their consumption, because there's some levels of toxins in plants that they cannot digest. But if we give them a cheap and easy detoxifying agent that's provided to them regularly and they have lots of experience with it, they can start to learn how to use it and how much to use when they're integrating it with their dietary mixing that they do as a normal part of their lives. And this example here for you is provision, this time not of Bruce's Brew, this is just some short-term jackpotting with animals, but the nuance and the subtleties that exists in self-herding is almost limitless. So I've picked out one example here that for the animals accessing feed out of a drum, such as on the right, is a different experience than accessing it out of the low trough on the left. So if one didn't know that to be a reality in the field, you could actually be trying out something as an attractant or a supplement potentially, and be getting a lower than desirable levels of consumption of that stuff that you've presumably bought to go and increase your business results. And just by not actually observing the fact that the behavioural part of animals accessing feeds is as important as the nutritive value of the feeds themselves. And so I've thrown this example in partly in response to a question, some questions from last week, but also making a point of how big is this potentially from what you can get out of your business. So now this particular study there, where you can see that we've achieved 1/3 higher daily gains with sheep in controlled circumstances, was done utilising, in this case, not self-herding competencies, which are level 4 competencies. It's actually achieved using stress-free stockmanship, utilising that's level 3 livestock competencies. So I'll just let that settle there for a moment. 1/3 more daily gain, and nothing else changed except we changed the people and the way they were interacting with the animals. So it's not just about the times they were there, is it? Because it just couldn't be just that, could it? Think about the lasting effect that those people were able to get on their animals and get that 1/3 more daily gain. Feedlot number 3 didn't get a major change, but they still got many other benefits. So there's a range of responses that you can get from 0 to a lot, and it's up to you to decide how much you want to get out of these procedures and how deeply you want to understand them. So if we control animal distribution, that then has effects on the vegetation cover, which then goes backwards and forwards to many of those other factors that you can read there. And we can do animal distribution, redistribution, I should say, by control and exclusion on the right-hand bottom side, or we can do it with guidance and self-herding. So we have a number of tools, and of course I want to be sure that you understand that control and exclusion aren't necessarily bad as such. I'm not making that case. I'm just making the case that they often cost a lot more and they're very intensive to get the same result that could be achieved by getting the animals to choose to do what we want. And so back to that analogy of choice is more like pulling on the string, force is more like pushing on the string. And when people implement this all across Australia, then there's all sorts of different approaches that they want to do at different sizes for really different reasons. And all of those things are right. And there's no one average farmer, there's no one average pastoralist, of course, and they're all different. And all of this goes in to the conversations that we have to develop up ongoing self-herding planning regimes that start to make a difference. And we need to test some of those all the time in the same way that you would do if you were riding a horse. It's just not the one recipe for every horse. Every horse is different. People riding horses intimately know that, but it's not been often accepted in our livestock enterprises, especially business-wise, that you can actually evolve this thing to be more and more locally adapted. And if it is better locally adapted, you get more money off the same patch of ground. just by changing the behavioural adaptation. And the self-herding principles are 7, and you can read them there. I won't read them for you. But the more you think about all of those, the more it is obvious that they are an interconnected spider web, sometimes large in effect, sometimes small, sometimes really important to change, sometimes not so important to change at all. But everything has broad consequences. Every time we change those animals and the way they are operating across the landscape, then we change a lot of things in response to that. And they, once again, don't necessarily need to be told to do things, such as in the Larson cartoon on the right. So a review panel here for you to sum up not only today, but also the possibilities that we've been covering over the last 3 weeks. If self-herding can change your behaviours quickly and cheaply, that's really a big paradigm shift for a lot of livestock owners who think things tend to be fixed and expensive to change. But once a behaviour is fixed, then it can be very, very long lasting, and we can keep it at a high level of habitual repetition by small amounts of reinforcement. And using self-herding means that the individuals can express their own choices as well as the group exercising a choice. So here is the difference between us engaging in rotational grazing using self-herding as the tool across a landscape, and where individuals then can peel off from the group and get some plant resources that they need as an individual that day, but the rest of the group aren't interested in, versus if we go the standard approach and utilise the confinement, then if you're an individual that really needs and desires something just today from another part of the property, but you're prevented from doing that by the fencing, then you are restricted. Your individual performance will be less than it could be optimally. So we're going to do all of this stuff in basics, just like every other animal behaviouralist knows, whether you're teaching a dolphin, a dog, a dingo or an elephant, doesn't matter. We are going to cue rewards with clear signals and realise it's clear signals that help us. So, and once we have done that and got the clear signals associated with rewards, then we only need to occasionally reinforce that behaviour with rewards. So there's the deal. You don't have to keep on feeding them lots of chocolate to get them to know that they like chocolate, as an analogy. And this makes animals so much more productive because they can exercise their individual and group choices. We're actually dealing with deep behavioural issues here where the animals are more at ease doing what they're doing, and we want them to put on kilos of whatever we're trying to grow in as short a time as possible. And this is one of the easiest and quickest and most effective ways to get that to happen. And if you have invested in other things to raise production, such as water or pastures or fences or whatever, this actually gives you a higher payoff because it's a magnifier of the effect of whatever you've spent your good money on. And it's a huge, really wide toolbox for management, and which continues to grow. And it's by working with producers on the various research and development programs that we're involved in constantly around Australia that more and more ideas are getting added to this and more useful tools and tactics. And through some follow-up questions and comments from the previous week, so if you wish to go for some more in-depth reading here, I would very, very much recommend Fred Provenza's book called Nourishment there. That's Fred on the left, worked with Fred for over a dozen years now, and part of his work with the Behave team out of Utah State University in the US was really highly influential on myself and Dean Revell in our development of self-herding. And without a number of those key insights, we would not have been able to tread the path that we have been able to. For those of you wanting even more technical and in-depth book to read, you can go and read The Art and Science of Shepherding, which is edited by Michael Murray and Fred Provenza, and that examines the French herders. So that's active herding in landscapes that still happens to this day and is indeed taught as a formal subject. So that's for some more in-depth substance there for you. I couldn't recommend it more. But for you wanting to start, which I always encourage folks to go out and start doing some things, please do return at some stage and obtain some more formal and structured learning on this, because it is a really, really wide subject now, and it's easy to just be exposed to one or two parts of the tactics and then form the view that that's what self-herding is about, when in fact it has a monstrously wonderful range of possibilities for you, some of which you may be almost the only person implementing them because your needs are different than everybody else. It's lovely that self-herding actually assists individual and group choices amongst the livestock, but also that's exactly what we find with all the producers, the humans that we deal with, that we're able to assist people with their own individual circumstances, as well as for all of us doing things for the greater good. But thank you, and we'll move to the question and answer portion of this seminar.